Officer Daniel Morris always thought he knew the city and its people. For him, each night on patrol was a routine, a drift through misty alleys and neon-lit streets, a quiet observation of lives unfolding far away from the bright, sanitized picture often presented in the pages of the police report. But that night, as the bitter wind blew and the fog curled around the streetlights, Daniel's finely tuned sense of order was about to be unsettled by a case that would challenge everything he believed about right and wrong. It began when a call crackled over the radio, a report of a suspicious person loitering near the old park. The voice on the dispatch was hurried, anxious, as if fearing that an elusive criminal was watching from the dark corners. With a frown, Daniel adjusted his collar, leaned into the steering wheel, and drove off toward the park. As he neared, his eyes caught the silhouette of a disheveled figure huddled by a rusted bench, arms wrapped around a blanket that had seen better days. The figure, with his long unkempt hair and sun-weathered face, seemed at first glance to be just another soul lost in the vast anonymity of the city, but Daniel did not pause for understanding. With the sternness of law written into his very being, he got out of the car and marched towards the homeless man. "What are you doing here, huh?" Daniel barked, his voice steely with authority. The veteran's eyes, initially filled with sleep and exhaustion, widened in disbelief as the cop loomed over him. "Get off the bench, or I'll have you removed." The words, heavy with condescension, stung more than Daniel ever intended. The man, initially silent, slowly lifted his gaze, revealing a pair of tired, soulful eyes that had witnessed more than any man should. There was a flicker deep within them that wasn't fear, but a hint of sorrow mingled with a quiet anger. Unbeknownst to Daniel, the man he confronted was none other than Harold Hal Jenkins, a veteran whose name had once shone bright in the annals of military commendations. Hal had served his country with honor, a fact obscured by the years of neglect and silent suffering that had led him to this very bench, where he now sought refuge from a society that had forgotten its debt of gratitude. To Daniel, however, Hal's ragged appearance was enough to justify his tongue-lashing. The cop's tone bordered on bullying, reinforcing an unfortunate preconception that those who have lost everything cannot be respected. Hal's voice, though soft, was firm. "I'm just trying to remember my past," he murmured, almost to himself. His words fell on deaf ears as Daniel continued. "Your past doesn't give you the right to take up space on public property. You need to move." An uncomfortable silence descended as people passing by kept their heads down, indifferent or too afraid to intervene. The night was charged with tension as Daniel rounded on Hal, unaware that this confrontation was the beginning of an unraveling of long-held assumptions. The next few days brought whispers among Daniel's colleagues, rumors of a disruptive altercation, a man once celebrated for his heroism now condemned to the fringes of society. Daniel dismissed them as gossip until one evening he encountered another twist in the city's tapestry of unlikely events. After finishing his shift, as the rain started to patter softly on the pavement, Daniel found himself drawn back to the park. There, among the scattered memories of garbage and lost dreams, he noticed a group of people gathered around someone speaking with quiet authority. Intrigued despite himself, Daniel approached with caution. The man in the center was none other than a local historian, Miss Eleanor Reeves, who was known to share tales of the city's unsung heroes. Eleanor's voice was tinged with reverence and sadness as she told a story of valor and sacrifice. "He fought in a distant war not for glory but for the sake of others," she said, glancing at the small bronze medallion that hung from her neck. "His name is Harold Jenkins, a man whose legacy should have been celebrated, not shunned." A knot of unease formed in Daniel's stomach as Eleanor continued, detailing Jenkins' illustrious career in the military, a career decorated with medals, commendations, and the respect of fellow soldiers from battlefields across the globe. For Daniel, the realization was a shock. The very man he had berated only days earlier was no common vagrant. He was a war hero, a man whose courage and sacrifice had once been honored by the nation. Regret assaulted him with a force he had never experienced before. In that moment, the lines between duty, personal prejudice, and the true meaning of heroism blurred. Daniel's mind raced back to the countless times he had heard about the brave soldiers returning from battles, only to live out the rest of their days in obscurity. Before him was a stark reminder that appearances often deceived, and the value of a life was not always visible in the mirror of society. Unable to shake the tormenting mix of emotions, Daniel sought out Hal. He found him the following morning, nestled once again on the same rusted bench, the early light of dawn reflecting on his weathered face. Approaching slowly, Daniel crouched by the bench, his eyes conveying more humility than authority. "Sir," he began, his tone tentative and remorseful, "I'm Daniel Morris. I need to apologize for my behavior. I was wrong to judge you hastily. I didn't know your story." Hal's tired eyes met Daniel's, and in their depths, the sincerity of regret and the hope for redemption mingled. "I fought for something," Hal replied quietly, "but sometimes the battles don't end when you leave the field. I lost my way here after the war. It wasn't my choice to become what you see now." That conversation marked a turning point for both men. Daniel took it upon himself to learn more about the man behind the medals he had so carelessly dismissed. As the days unfolded, Daniel began researching military records at the precinct library, consulting old war archives, and even reaching out to Veterans Affairs. What he uncovered was staggering, a series of commendations and honors that told the tale of an extraordinary man whose valor in combat had saved countless lives. Hal had been wounded in the line of duty, had endured unimaginable horrors on distant battlefields, and had carried the burdens of guilt and trauma long after the war had ended. The medals that were now hidden beneath layers of grime on his tattered uniform, medals that once shone as symbols of honor, were proof of a life devoted to ideals larger than himself. Haunted by the weight of his mistakes, Daniel vowed to make amends. More than an apology, he desired to help restore what had been forgotten. With Hal's permission, Daniel began advocating for better services for veterans, fighting within the precinct to allocate resources for mental health and housing support. Slowly, Daniel set in motion a series of changes that extended far beyond his narrow view of duty. Together, he and Hal organized community meetings at the local center, where the veteran would quietly share his experiences with those willing to listen. His stories were raw and unfiltered. They spoke of the horrors of war, the camaraderie among soldiers, and the crushing despair that followed when the noise of battle faded into a cruel, silent world. For many in attendance, it was a revelation, a window into a past that had long been sacrificed at the altar of national security and forgotten by politics. As Hal's story reached more ears, the community began to rally behind efforts to acknowledge and honor its unsung heroes. A small group of local businessmen, moved by Hal's words and Daniel's earnest advocacy, joined forces to raise funds for a permanent memorial at the old park. They envisioned a commemorative garden, a tranquil space where veterans would be celebrated and remembered, and where every citizen could be reminded that true heroism was not measured by outward appearances. Daniel found himself at the epicenter of this transformation, unsure whether it was redemption he sought or merely a desperate attempt to quiet the nagging voice in his conscience that had grown louder with every passing day. The journey was not without hurdles, however. Many within the precinct were skeptical of Daniel's newfound crusade. Some whispered that he was tarnishing the image of law enforcement by aligning himself with a man they considered a drifter. Others, entrenched in bureaucratic inertia, dismissed his proposals as mere tokenism. In one particularly heated meeting, a senior officer challenged him directly in front of a room full of peers. "Officer Morris," the man said, voice dripping with disdain, "we do not have the luxury to chase after sentimental ghosts. Our job is to enforce the law, not to rewrite the honor of criminals or tramps." The remark stung, but Daniel held his ground. "I am not trying to rewrite history," he countered, his voice steady. "I am merely trying to ensure that those who have served our country are not cast aside. We owe them a debt that goes far beyond mere words." In the weeks that followed, the community slowly began to see tangible results. The park, once a neglected space overrun with weeds and litter, was transformed. Volunteers inspired by Hal's story and the efforts of Daniel gathered every weekend to plant flowers and repair broken benches. Daniel himself spent countless evenings working side by side with local residents, his hands dirtied by the soil of restoration, a symbolic act of cleansing his own past mistakes. Hal, who had once sat in silence behind layers of bitterness, began to open up. He recounted his days on the front lines, a time when medals were earned not as prizes but as burdens of responsibility. Evenings spent sharing memories turned into sessions of catharsis, where other veterans in attendance timidly started to share their own heartaches. The park gradually evolved into a beacon of hope, a place where the forgotten could be remembered and where community ties were reforged. As autumn descended upon the city, a special event was organized to unveil the Memorial Garden in honor of veterans, both celebrated and unsung. Daniel and Hal stood side by side before the gathered crowd, a blend of city officials, veterans, and everyday citizens. A hush fell over the audience as the mayor spoke, recounting the sacrifices made by those who had stared death in the face and had never sought glory in return. Today, the mayor declared, we honor not just the victories of war, but also the triumph of the human spirit. Let this garden remind us that every life, every sacrifice, is worthy of respect and remembrance. As he pulled the ceremonial cloth away, revealing the gleaming plaque inscribed with Hal's name and a list of his commendations, there was a palpable shift in the air. Applause broke out, sincere and resonant, echoing around the newly restored park. Daniel found himself overwhelmed, tears pricking the corners of his eyes as he looked at Hal, who stood with a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with the long, painful years of neglect. In that moment, an unspoken bond was forged between the cop who had once bullied a homeless veteran and the war hero who had borne the weight of sacrifice in silence. The night sky, now clearer than it had been in years, seemed to glitter with the promise of redemption and newfound purpose. In the quiet days that followed, life within the precinct began to change in subtle yet perceptible ways. Daniel's transformation had opened a dialogue about the treatment of vulnerable members of the community, prompting a series of reforms aimed at better understanding and compassion. Training sessions were organized so that officers could learn more about mental health challenges, trauma, and the invisible scars carried by those who had served in far-off conflicts. Slowly, the rigid separation between duty and empathy began to blur, and within those hallowed halls of law enforcement, a new respect was born. Yet, just as the community was beginning its slow march toward healing, an unexpected twist reared its head. A man came forward, a former comrade of Hal's from his days in the military, bearing documents and photographs that provided even deeper insight into the heroic deeds of the veteran. Frank Whitaker, a rugged yet soft-spoken man with a deep and resonant voice, recalled in vivid detail how Hal had once charged into a firefight to rescue a fellow soldier. He didn't flinch, Frank insisted, holding up a faded photograph of a group of soldiers with their arms around each other, Hal standing proudly in the center. He should have been decorated with the highest honors, not forgotten to rot on a park bench. The evidence was irrefutable. Hal Jenkins was not merely a casualty of circumstance, but a man whose valor had saved lives in moments when every second counted. The new revelation sent shockwaves through the community and the police department alike. Daniel's colleagues, who had once doubted his judgment, now found their opinions forced to change. Conversations that once dismissed Hal's existence as a cautionary tale of post-war neglect were now infused with admiration for his courage. For Daniel, every conversation, every nod of recognition from fellow officers, brought deeper meaning to his journey of redemption. He recalled the early days when he had viewed the world in black and white, where the lines between right and wrong were drawn in stark contrasts. Now, in the intricate shades of gray that he had come to understand, he found that true heroism often hid behind scars and silence, and that redemption was not found by perpetuating anger, but by seeking truth, forgiveness, and change. In a poignant twist of fate, Daniel was later honored at a ceremonial event not as a guardian of the law, but as a catalyst for compassion and reform. The honor he received was modest, a plaque recognizing his efforts to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community's most vulnerable members. It was clear to all that this recognition was not for personal accolades, but for the awakening of an officer's conscience who had chosen to look beyond appearances and prejudices to find the beating heart of humanity. Standing at the podium, Daniel's voice trembled as he addressed the assembly. I once saw a man on a bench and judged him without knowing his story. Today, that same man is celebrated as a hero. Let his story remind all of us that our duty is not just to enforce the law, but to serve with honor, understanding, and love for those who have given so much. As seasons changed and years passed, the Memorial Garden became a meeting place for veterans, family members, and citizens who wished to remember and be inspired by the valor of those who had fought for a cause greater than themselves. Children grew up hearing Hal's story, not as a cautionary tale of neglect, but as a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Daniel continued his work within the precinct, now a respected figure who epitomized the ideals of reform and reconciliation. His journey from ignorance to enlightenment reshaped not just his career, but the entire community's perception of heroism and the importance of caring for those who bore invisible burdens. There were still dark days, the kind where memories of past mistakes threatened to overwhelm him, but Daniel carried with him the steady reminder of Hal's quiet strength and the countless lives silently touched by both of their journeys. In visits to the park, the old bench remained a silent witness to how far they had both come. Hal, sometimes found sitting there with his eyes closed as if reliving old battles, would smile softly whenever Daniel joined him, and in those shared moments, words were unnecessary. They had learned that forgiveness and transformation often began in the most unlikely of places, a cold park bench under a chilly, persistent sky. A particularly cold winter accentuated the stark contrast between the past and the present. The once forgotten bench was now a place of pilgrimage. Stories of valor, personal loss, and quiet triumph echoed in the wind that whipped through the trees. Daniel would sometimes find himself lost in reflection, recalling the officer he once was, blinded by stereotypes and pride. The transformation was not complete, he knew, and that was why every day was a struggle to be better. But even in the hardest moments, the memory of Hal's narrative reminded him that empathy was a battle worth fighting, a war against the prejudices that threatened to dehumanize those who needed understanding the most. One frigid December day, an unexpected guest arrived at the memorial gathering. A newspaper reporter from a major regional outlet, intrigued by the local champion of reform, sought to interview both Daniel and Hal. The resulting article, published in bold headlines that read, "From the bench to the battlefield, the untold story of a cop and a veteran," fanned the flames of public interest. The story captured not only the transformation of a single police officer, but the collective awakening of an entire community toward recognizing the quiet sacrifices of its heroes. Letters poured in from near and far, some in gratitude for giving voice to those long silenced, others in surprise and admiration of how one act of bullying had, in the end, led to a journey of redemption. In private moments after the public acclaim had faded, Daniel often sat alone and pondered the irony of the day's events. How could cruelty born of ignorance evolve into a lifelong pledge of service and compassion? He wondered if anyone ever truly changed, or if some seeds of regret and enlightenment forever lay dormant until nurtured by the harshest circumstances. Deep down, he was convinced that redemption was possible, even for those who had once inflicted pain on others. The scars from past mistakes, though never fully erased, served as lessons engraved in the heart, a constant reminder that every person has hidden depths, every soul wears scars unseen, and that compassion must be extended even when it is most difficult to find. Spring arrived in gentle bursts after the harsh winter, and with it, the park underwent another transformation. The garden was now in full bloom, a vivid tapestry of colors that celebrated life, resilience, and hope. Veterans visited often, some with their families, each sharing their own recollections of valor, sorrow, and ultimately healing. Daniel still worked as a uniformed officer, though his role had subtly shifted. More than ever, he was seen as a guardian of the community who remembered that behind every faceless figure on the street was a story waiting to be heard. His eyes held empathy, and his conversations carried the weight of understanding earned through countless nights of introspection. The turning point in Daniel's journey came unexpectedly one summer evening. As the sun dipped low over the horizon, he encountered a young man who had been embroiled in yet another street altercation. The youngster's eyes, wild with anger and confusion, reminded Daniel of a time when everything seemed hopeless. Instead of reacting as he might have before, Daniel slowly knelt down and engaged the troubled youth in conversation. Over the ensuing months, that interaction blossomed into mentorship, a guiding light for a generation lost in cycles of violence and disillusionment. Daniel's relationship with the young man became a microcosm of what he had learned, that behind every aggressive exterior, there could be a hidden plea for help, a silent cry for someone to truly see them. As the mentorship grew, Daniel's colleagues began to witness the profound impact of his changed perspective. Fatigued eyes softened at the sight of him carefully mediating disputes, even as he balanced the burdens of duty and empathy. There were moments when Daniel's memories of bullying Hal came crashing back in vivid detail, moments that he used as constant reminders of what he must never become. And as he recounted his journey to new recruits, he emphasized that the true essence of policing involved not just enforcing the law, but nurturing the human spirit. The transformation of one cop into a compassionate leader began to ripple outward, influencing attitudes, policies, and attitudes of every officer willing to confront their own biases. On a cool autumn afternoon several years later, a ceremony was held to commemorate a new chapter for the city. Council members, local veterans, and even a few former officers gathered at the memorial garden. The centerpiece of the event was a symbolic renaming of the park bench where Hal had sat that fateful night. The bench was dedicated as the Legacy Bench, a small but poignant monument to a life of sacrifice and the transformative power of compassion. In his address, Daniel recalled the initial encounter that had shaken him to his core, and he expressed gratitude for the opportunity to rebuild bridges where once there was only division. "Every scar has its story," he said solemnly, "and every soul, no matter how battered, deserves the chance to be heard, to find healing." His voice, carried by the cool breeze, resonated with every person present, a living reminder that redemption was not an abstract concept but a tangible reality, achievable through understanding and mutual respect. As the years turned, the garden became more than a memorial. It evolved into a gathering place for community debates on social justice, mental health awareness, and the proper care for those who had once served their country. Daniel would occasionally stand by the garden's edge, his eyes softly tracking a stray leaf carried by the wind, musing on the irony of fate. He had once been a man who believed his role was to enforce rules, but he had grown to understand that the true enforcement was of kindness, compassion, and truth. Every challenge, every regret, every act of cruelty that led him to Hal's quiet bench had ultimately taught him that lies and prejudice could be vanquished by the light of acceptance, and even those marred by life's harshness were capable of inspiring change. The ripples of change continued to extend beyond the confines of the city. Inspired by the local transformation, other precincts and organizations in neighboring towns began initiating similar programs aimed at supporting veterans and bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. Daniel was invited to speak at conferences and seminars, where he recounted his journey from a narrow-minded enforcer to a compassionate advocate. His speeches, interwoven with the poignant narrative of Hal's life, resonated deeply with audiences. "We cannot judge a man by his appearance or where he finds refuge," he would say, "for the hardest battles are often fought in silence, and true valor is hidden behind eyes that have seen too much sorrow yet choose to smile in the face of adversity." His words traveled far, fostering a new understanding that helped reshape societal attitudes about homelessness, heroism, and the transformative power of a single empathetic act. In one particularly memorable encounter, Daniel met with a group of retired officers who had long struggled to reconcile the harsh realities of their past actions with the desire for a new beginning. Over cups of steaming coffee in a modest diner off the beaten path, stories were exchanged of wounded souls who had fought valiantly on the battlefield only to return to civilian life battered by neglect and misunderstanding. Daniel lent a patient ear and shared his own journey of regret and redemption. Names were spoken softly, and nods of recognition were exchanged as the former officers acknowledged deeds long buried under layers of duty and silence. That evening, as rain pattered rhythmically on the diner's roof, bonds formed and forgiveness was extended. A small congregation of those who had lived through the tumult of life and now found solace in the understanding that past mistakes could, indeed, be overcome by hope and genuine connection. Time, relentless and restorative, continued to shape both Daniel and the community he had come to love. Hal's days of isolation gradually gave way to public recognition, and while the veteran never actively sought fame, the honors bestowed upon him were a sign that his sacrifices were no longer forgotten. His medals, once hidden under the grime of disappointment and pain, now shimmered in the light during community ceremonies, reminders of a hero's duty that transcended the battlefield. For Hal, each medal carried its own story, a mosaic of bravery, sacrifice, and the bittersweet realities of war. And though he never sought to embellish his legacy, the city's narrative had embraced him, weaving his once muted story into the larger tapestry of collective remembrance. In reflecting on the winding path that had brought them both to this day, Daniel often mused on the power of a chance encounter, a meeting of two souls from entirely different walks of life that forged a bond capable of healing generations. Every small act of kindness, every petition signed for reform, and every conversation held at the Memorial Garden added a layer to a movement that refused to be defined solely by the scars of the past. And in a world often resistant to change, the transformation of a single cop bullying a homeless veteran into a community figure of compassion was nothing short of miraculous. The journey was far from over, even as twilight descended over the city, gently cloaking it in soft shades of remembrance. The garden, the bench, and the medallions all served as living testaments to the idea that redemption and growth are possible when even the most hardened hearts are willing to listen. Officers on patrol would sometimes pause by the memorial, a silent ritual acknowledging that honor, empathy, and a willingness to change were the true pillars of service. Daniel, his uniform now adorned not just with the emblem of law enforcement but with the invisible medals of experiences, regret, growth, and empathy, walked the streets with a renewed sense of purpose, hopeful that every story, however painful, could inspire a brighter future. On an evening much like the one that had started it all, as the city's lights flickered on one by one, the park bench stood in quiet dignity beneath a star-strewn sky. It had witnessed sorrow and joy, confrontation and forgiveness, cruelty and compassion, each chapter leaving an indelible mark upon those who passed by. In that silent witness, there was a promise that even in the heart of a bustling city where shadows of the past clung stubbornly, the light of redemption could break through. And as Hal sat, a gentle smile playing upon his lips as he gazed at the gathering of those who had come to honor his journey, he knew that his story was no longer one of forgotten sacrifice but a beacon for future generations, a call to see with open hearts and to act with understanding. The city, with all its imperfections and hidden dramas, had become a canvas for transformation. Every time Daniel noticed a neighbor lending a hand or a stranger offering a kind word, he was reminded of that fateful night when a call from the radio changed not just his route, but his entire perspective on life. His journey from the moment of reckoning with Hal's true identity to the blossoming of a community dedicated to remembering lost heroes was a reminder that the true measure of a society lay not in its monuments or its statistics, but in the compassion it extended to its most vulnerable, and, in doing so, uplifted the forgotten. In the years that followed, long after the initial shock of discovery and the turmoil of change had quieted into a steady rhythm of hope, the legacy of that cold night lived on. New officers, raised in an environment where sensitivity was valued as much as authority, carried forward the lessons learned. Veterans who had once felt invisible found in the Memorial Garden a sense of belonging, their sacrifices recognized not just by medals but by the hearts of a community that had finally learned to see them. Daniel's transformation, a gentle rebellion against the harshness of routine, had ignited a spark that spread outward, touching lives in ways that transcended the boundaries of duty and decorum. And so, beneath the silver glow of the moon, as the wind whispered softly through the leaves of the Memorial Garden, the story of a cop who once bullied a homeless veteran, only to learn that the man was a war hero with medals, became a timeless parable. It was a lesson etched in the annals of a city that learned, through trial and redemption, that every life was layered with intricate beauty and that behind every rough exterior lay a story of immeasurable worth. In that quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit, Daniel, Hal, and the community found a legacy that would forever serve as a reminder that even in the darkest corners, redemption when sought with sincerity and compassion has the power to transform not just one life, but entire worlds. The journey continues as each person who passes by the legacy bench is invited to pause and reflect, to remember that every bruise on a battle-worn soul is a chapter in a saga of bravery and sacrifice. Through struggles and triumphs, the seemingly small act of an apology had rewritten histories and reawakened the communal conscience. In that transformation, the city discovered that true progress lay in acknowledging the intricate layers of each individual, each veteran, each cop, each citizen, and in celebrating the quiet victories that came from standing up for what is right, even when it meant changing one's own fate. And as the crowd dispersed that crisp evening, one could still hear the soft murmur of memories carried by the wind, a promise that every act of kindness was a step toward healing, and that even the most unlikely of encounters could light the path to redemption. From that day onward, the park, the bench, and the heroic legacy of Harold Jenkins became a permanent chapter in the city's continuing story, an enduring reminder that true heroism requires us to look beyond surface judgments, to seek empathy, and to honor the silent sacrifices of those who have given everything so that others might live in hope. In that shared journey of regret and forgiveness, the city found not only a way to heal its wounds, but also the strength to forge a brighter future, one built on the foundations of respect, humility, and unwavering compassion. And so, as the long, winding night gave way to another hopeful dawn, Officer Daniel Morris journeyed on, a man forever changed by a homeless veteran's story, a story that reminded all who heard it that behind every medal and every tear lay a life of unyielding courage, a testament to the extraordinary power of redemption when nurtured by love, community, and the simple willingness to see another human being for who they truly are.